I'm now excited to welcome Dr. Joseph Guzzi, Professor of Economics at Washington and Lee University, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Randall Akee.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'm Joseph Guzzi. I'm at Washington and Lee University, and it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Randall Akee today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to read a land acknowledgement, and I recognize that we're on a Zoom call and people are spread out all over the place. But I'm at Washington and Lee, so I'm going to read one that's sort of specific to our area. But I encourage you all to learn about the local land where you are and the people who live there now or lived there before your time. This land acknowledgement was written by Vicki Ferguson, who is a Monacan Indian member and serves as sort of Washington and Lee's de facto liaison to that tribe. She writes, the land that we are on is but a small portion of the land inhabited by the people who call themselves the Yesa. These Eastern Siouan-speaking people inhabit the land in the interior portion of Virginia, from the New River to the fall lines at Richmond for well over 1,000 years before the arrival of Europeans. Through years of warfare, disease, forced migration, and broken treaties, the original people were reduced to a fraction of their original numbers, living on a small portion of their land. They were forced into assimilation by the dominant culture. The descendants of these original inhabitants are still here today. We know them as the Monacan, and they understand the land is the people and the people is the land, and they are not strangers on any of the land that was once inhabited, that was once considered their territory. As we are able to have air to breathe and water to drink, remember these original people have been stewards of the land for centuries and have made it possible for us to enjoy many of the natural resources we still have today. We honor the Monacan and their ancestors. Randall Akee is a professor at UCLA in the Department of Public Policy and American Indian Studies. He earned his BA in economics from Dartmouth. He has a master's in development economics from Yale and a PhD in political economy from Harvard University. His main fields are labor economics and development economics, and this means that he can and does study almost anything and everything that has to do with the causes and consequences of poverty and inequality. He has published well over 40 articles in peer-reviewed journals on a wide range of topics from income mobility, health, education, access to healthcare, the role of political institutions in development, immigration, and public health issues such as COVID. Much of this work focuses on American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian people and tribes, among other vulnerable populations. A small sample of research questions from this paper include: how did the Great Recession affect labor force participation and incomes among indigenous populations in the United States? Has Indian gaming enabled tribes to expand their judicial systems and build tribal institutions? What is the effect of additional income on obesity in low-income households compared to wealthier households? What is the effect of land parcels trust status on business development in Indian country? And how did COVID infections spread on American Indian reservations? I think this is just a small sample of the kinds of questions that Randall asks, and brings his very creative methodology and his mastery of data methods to answer. Randy is a leader who collaborates with researchers from a wide variety of fields and disciplines. He is affiliated with leading research centers, including the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Institute for the Study of Labor, the Brookings Institution, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, and the Center for Indian Country Economics at the Minneapolis Fed and the U.S. Census Bureau. He sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Economic Literature and the Journal of Economics, Race, and Policy. I don't really know how he has time to do all that, but we are thrilled that he has agreed to share his expertise and experiences and insights with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Randall Akee.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the wonderful introduction and for allowing me to be here and speak with you all a little bit. I also will acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm in Hollywood, California, which is the traditional homeland of the Tongva people, the Gabrielino people of Southern California. And so, again, I'm appreciative of being here physically, but also with all of you, and happy to share some of my thoughts on the role of poverty and its impact on children and long-run outcomes. And I'll show you some slides. I'm going to share my screen right now and full screen. So I'll provide some slides. You can see there's only about 15 of them, and then we can, we can chat afterwards a little bit about the research that I'll talk about here. I'm only going to sort of touch lightly on some of my prior research with others, but I'm happy to talk more about the effort that it takes to get to that, to the research, and as well as the ways in which you can take this research and use it in advocacy, use it in pushing to change for policy, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of programs and that are currently in place. And I see that as an important role, especially for communities and peoples and populations that often don't have access to data or don't have access or don't have ready access to evaluation and resources to do advocacy on their own behalf. And so I see that as part of my role, and many of the other people that I work with, people like Professor Guze and others as well. I think our research sort of lays some resources out there for others to pick up and use in various ways, and I'm happy to talk more about that. So, just to show you the difficulties in undertaking work in areas, these are a bunch of different national surveys that exist. The columns here, CPS is the current population survey, SIP is this survey of income and program participation. That's a way we know sort of the kinds of social service programs people are using. The National Health Interview Survey, NHIS, tells us about health outcomes and ailments that people have on a nationally representative basis. The Behavioral Risk BRFSS, Behavioral Risk Factors Social Survey, tells us about the kind of risky behaviors people take, the kind, sometimes it's abuse, sometimes it's sort of alcohol, drug addiction data. And so it's again, nationally representative. And then the last one is the Survey of Consumer Finance. And that's the data set that is used to really tell us about what wealth is owned by people in the United States in various forms. And so I show you these various data sets. Again, they're slightly dated from the early 2000s, but they're, if you're looking at small populations, they are not really covered that well. These are sort of the number of observations in this row here for the white population across these, and pretty well represented. Black, not too bad either. If you're looking at American Indian, Alaska Native, you see that there's, some numbers in the current population survey, but almost nothing in the SIP. Nothing in the SIP, not enough observations to be statistically reportable, and definitely nothing for the Survey of Consumer Finance. Asians, it's a little bit better representation, but again, there are some places where there's nothing, such as the Survey of Consumer Finance. And the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, you see the numbers are really small. And so this is, again, just across the race. Ethnic groups, Hispanics also sometimes are well represented in some data sets and sometimes not in others. But if you start creating other intersectional categories, such as recent immigrants, or LGBTQ plus populations, then you start getting even smaller numbers when you want to look within these race and ethnic categories. So you can see some part of the problem. And so that is one of the things that I work on quite often, is figuring out ways to identify additional data, create data, or use existing data that is out there and figure out ways to join data sets to make them operable and usable for research and analysis. But this is a pervasive problem for small populations in general. And often these are the populations that are quite vulnerable and the ones we want to know and want to be able to track progress over time. And these are the exact populations that we don't have data for. We don't have systematic data across time geography, and populations, unfortunately. Okay. So, here's an example. So as I mentioned in the last slide in the survey of consumer finance, we actually don't have measures of wealth for American Indian Alaska Natives because it's a high cost to survey these relatively small populations, and we don't get usable data. So I, with some colleagues of mine, a number of years ago, conducted a survey of American Indians American Indians and other populations residing in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So just for one city at one point in time, we asked these questions on, what are the value of your liquid assets? What are the value of your financial assets? What are the value of your tangible assets? And, what is your overall net worth? And so here I just show it's a much bigger paper. There's a much bigger tables, lots more detail if you're interested. But if you look at the average for white residents of Tulsa, the value of liquid assets is about $95,000. If you look for the Native American population, it's about $61,000. So you see there are stark differences across in all of these. If you look at things like the median, which we think is actually the better measure because there are some extreme outliers at the very high end. So the median tells us the person at the 50th percentile what they actually hold. We see that the value of liquid assets is only about $5,000 for the average white resident of Tulsa. But if you look for the Native, the median, the 50th percentile Native person, it's about $250, right? Very, very small amounts. And then if you look at, because we were able to oversample for tribal enrollment and different tribes, tribal affiliations and citizenship, we were able to look at, on the bottom part here, Cherokee enrolled and Muskogee Creek enrolled. And there you again see differences between different groups. But what I thought was really stark is that, at the median, so up into and including the 50th percentile of Muskogee Creek enrolled citizens living in Tulsa, their liquid assets are $0. And so, again, thinking about sort of the stories that don't get told or the stories that are underreported, this is one of those situations where because we don't typically have data on populations like this, I don't think too many people knew that the disparities across the different tribally enrolled citizens residing in Tulsa, Oklahoma were so starkly different. And one can only find these things out from data, from information. And I think that is one of those insights that we weren't expecting to be so starkly different. So again, that was hopefully just to give you a taste of the overview of, again, the difficulty in getting data for populations, small populations, and the insight that you can get once you do have access to data that's reliable and high quality. So now what I'm going to show you is some other research that I've done over time, looking at people's incomes, primarily parental income, and its impact on children, both in the intermediate and then long run. And so these are sort of titles from about 5 different papers that I and other colleagues have written using aspects of this same data set. And so that's one of the things that comes to mind once there's a data set that's a person creates or sort of puts together. One wants to undertake and investigate all aspects of that data set because it's so difficult for small populations. And the data set here is a data set that has been collected for almost 3 decades now, looking at a particular American Indian tribe and following the children over time, essentially every few years, surveying them and their parents for a large proportion of the time, and then ultimately when the children become adults themselves, following them and their outcomes into adulthood. And this is a unique research environment because a few years into the study, a tribal casino opened up on the American Indian reservation in this particular case. And one of the results was that the tribal government decided to provide cash transfers to all of its tribal citizens. And this functioned primarily as a universal basic income decades before people were really talking about it. So this started in the mid 1990s. And so what we have now is almost 30 years of a universal basic income program that we can evaluate, that we can examine and see what the impact of this cash transfer program had on the lives of the affected individuals. Because there's conversations about that currently in the US, and there's other countries as well as some demonstration projects going on currently right now in some cities throughout the US. But this is an example where a relatively small population has been undergoing this program for decades, and the results should be informative for the wider society. And so what I'll show you are some summaries of some of the research outcomes that are contained in these papers. So again, the way to think about it is these households were just, sort of living their lives. A cash transfer happened kind of unexpectedly, and everybody in the community that were part of this American Indian tribal nation that were enrolled citizens received a bump up in their income, unrelated to anything else. You just had to be a tribal citizen. So it didn't matter if you were working or not working, if you had children, if you didn't have children, if you were male or female, any age whatsoever. So it really is just essentially what we think of as universal basic income. And what we did is we followed, because again, the survey was primarily aimed at children, we follow the outcomes of the children. And what we found is that the increase of household income, and in particular for the families coming from who were initially, prior to the start of the cash transfer program and the casino operations, who were in poverty, we see that the children from those households at age 19 were 39% more likely to have graduated from high school than their untreated counterparts, either children who were non-Indian, as well as children who were older than that when the program started. We also find that by age 21, they have about 1.1 additional year of education. So they've gone to some sort of post-secondary education. We look at other results because you can link to public records of voting in this state, and we see that as in adulthood, the treated children are more likely to vote, be civically engaged. We also find that there are other measures here, such as behavioral or emotional disorders. During childhood, they decrease. Their mental health in adulthood, sort of when they become adults in their 20s and 30s. We also see that they, on average, are higher than those who didn't come from households that had this extra additional household income. We also have some measures during the child's childhood era, and we see that there's a reduction in parental fighting and also self-reported by the parents, drug and alcohol use. And so, we take this to be this idea that, removing the constraint of poverty has impacts on children in a very positive way, in the sense that perhaps they have a better sort of life experience and household experience with their parents, and it allows for better things to happen in terms of finishing school, in terms of being employed, and in terms of being civically engaged, and having also behavioral emotional disorders decreased over this time period. So again, this idea that poverty is, it just affects the current generation, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like it has this intergenerational impact. So in the absence of this universal basic income, these children would have been worse off than they actually were in adulthood. So now I'm going to show you part of the work that I and some colleagues have done to extend the work that I just showed you, because that was looking at a single American Indian reservation, a single state, to look at this at the nation as a whole, because tribal casinos opened up across essentially the other 48 states, the continental US, and figure out whether or not the results that occurred in that one community, one tribal nation, were generalizable or something that we found in across the different communities. So what we did was we joined a bunch of data on the tribal casino openings using administrative data, and administrative data that are collected and archived and recorded by different governmental agencies. In this case, it's the Census Bureau and the IRS data that I and others got special access to, confidential use, and special sworn status to use, again, be in a confidential setting, and approved for dissemination, that no individual, information was released. And so that's what I'll show you. I'll show you some of the results from that. What we did, the way to sort of read this graph is that across the x-axis are the number of years since a tribal casino opened. So this is 5 years on the far left here, 5 years before the casino opened, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And what we've done is we've taken all of the casino openings, and so they've opened in the 1990s, in the 2000s, and a few in the 2010s, and we've essentially put them all on the same time axis, and sort of normalized it to 0. And we look at adjusted gross income for the parents' generation. And we see that, prior to the casino opening, there wasn't a lot, these square symbols are sort of the estimated difference, but, they sort of hover around 0. There's one here that's slightly above the 0, but in general, the 5 years preceding the start of a casino operation, we don't see much, systematic change in adjusted gross income at the family level. After the start of the casino operations, however, you see here starting 0, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, you see that these amounts start to go up and they start to stay high and elevated, right, in approximately, somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 difference per year. And so this is sort of the impact of tribal casinos for households with kids that live on a reservation. They see their adjusted gross income go up by between $1,000 and $2,000 a year. And in this case, it could be due to the cash transfer program. It could also be due to increased employment. Here, we're not separating out right at this point differences between, better employment opportunities that might occur from the cash transfers themselves, because not all tribal governments provide cash transfers. Some do, some don't, depending on a variety of reasons that they decide. But nevertheless, at a very sort of macro level, it does appear that household incomes are going up, and they're going up, by a not insignificant amount over time. The next slide shows sort of the same sort of analysis again, but the outcome here instead is wages and salaries. So this is just, are people working and are they getting their income from wages and salaries? The other one was the sum of all sources, adjusted gross income. And we see about the same sort of results. So it does seem that there is an increase in employment and or the hourly rate or salaries that they're earning. It hovers around $1,000. So there may be the cash transfers, as we saw previously, that's also additional on top of this, but it does seem to be that there's higher wages and salaries occurring about, starting in year 3 or 4 after the casino starts to open. And so this is for the parents. And so we're also able, because we have this data that links parents to children, to look at the impact on the children, sort of when they are ages 20 to 26, so when they're adults themselves. Because again, the casino opening started in the 90s, some of the 2000s. And so if you were a child during that time period, currently you're in your mid-20s to 30s. And so what we wanted to do is, again, similar to the prior research, look at the impact of the casino opening, and that's here, or the cash transfer on some outcomes such as adjusted gross income. And what we find is that for American Indian children who lived on a reservation when a casino opened in their tribal nation, we find that having a casino that opened during their childhood, anytime between their ages 0 to 18, we see that in adulthood, again, when these children themselves are 20 to 26 years old, they have an adjusted gross income that's about $8,000 higher than an American Indian child who grew up on a reservation that didn't have a casino open up. And there were many places where casinos did not open up over time. If they had a cash transfer, we see that their adjusted gross incomes are also higher by about $2,000. We see an impact on wages by about $3,200, $3,300. And then we have some other variables, because in the IRS data, we know whether people claim, marital status or single status. And we find that they're, more likely to be married if a casino opened up during childhood, as well as cash transfers. So, these are telling us that, again, this extra economic activity, and again, not everybody was in poverty, just to be clear, some were, and we haven't separated that in this analysis right now, but we are finding that it's having an impact on the long-run outcomes of these children into adulthood. So I showed you in the previous slides those figures. It had an impact on the parents in terms of adjusted gross income and wages, but it's also having this intergenerational effect on the children themselves in their adulthood. And then the last thing I'll show you for this study is that because we have some measures of educational attainment in the American Community Survey data at the US Census, we were able to link a proportion, and a very small proportion. You see the number of observations here are just 9,000. And if you look back at the previous slide, we had almost 1 million observations for the children. But again, the American Community Survey is a sample of it's not the entire US population like the census is, but it gives you characteristics of the population. And what we're able to find is that for American Indians, again, residing on reservation, that were affected by casinos, we see that they have almost 9.8% higher percentage of college completion, college or more in total. And these results are, strongest for males, but well, not strongest, but they're equally divided between males and females. So this category here, column here, is just for men, and this one is just for women. But they're quite, not too small, I guess, is the point. So we see that the casino operations have affected educational attainment into the next generation as well. So the last thing I'll talk to you about is a newer project looking at it's a different way of looking at inequality and equity enhancing outcomes, and this is just the exposure to preschool programs, again for a Native American population, and we're looking at the impact of winning a lottery to attend a preschool for a particular Native American community children. And it's, again, looking at long-run effects on the children who won the lottery and attended a preschool compared to those who didn't win the lottery, and what their outcomes look like. And so the question here is, what's the effect of attending a preschool program on adult earnings? It's a question that many people are interested in. We think it's, again, it increases and enhances educational attainment, educational outcomes. There's been research done by education specialists as well as economists looking at this in various places. There's been very little, because there's been very little research looking at its impact on employment and earnings, because we haven't had these studies that have allowed for the length of time it required for attending a preschool program and adulthood. Here we have a specific example where, again, a program started in the 1990s, and so the children who were affected by the preschool lottery program are now adults themselves. And what I do with my colleague is look at their earnings through W-2s as well as 1040s, again, in a confidential setting. And we ask, what's the effect of winning this lottery, this admissions lottery to the preschools on the children themselves in adulthood? And we focus on a population of Native Indigenous students. And there's an institution that began providing preschool services in the 1990s at multiple locations and communities throughout the state. And the cost of going to these preschools were low to zero for the tribally enrolled tribal citizens. And there were very few other options. So the children who didn't get awarded the lottery, didn't win the lottery, probably didn't get an exposure to preschool programs. So it really is this stark difference that we're examining here. And so what I'll show you the results are in this graphical form. If you just start here looking at females, girls that won the lottery, who are now adults in adulthood, and we look at their wages, we see that this square tells us that the effect of winning the lottery and attending the preschool increases their wages in adulthood, right? Remember, this is preschool, in adulthood by almost 10%. That's what this number is here. So like between 8 and 9%, which is a really large amount in terms of the magnitude. We see that for boys, the result is still positive, but it's smaller in magnitude. It's not as big. It's between 2 and 3%. We also have information on the parents of these children at the time of application, whether their incomes were below or above the median, above the 50th percentile, below the 50th percentile. And that's what's shown here. And so what we see is that for the children who come from the below median family income, they seem to have slightly higher results impact than those who are above the median. And then if you interact female with above, below, and male with above, below, that's what you get on the right-hand side of this graph. And you see that it looks like girls who were treated to the preschool program and come from below median household incomes, they seem to have the largest effect. So this again talks to the access to education and the access to free or reduced cost education and preparation, pre-K in this case, maybe equity enhancing, improving outcomes even decades later in life. And this is one of the first research projects that's been able to show this really long range outcomes. The longest range outcomes that we haven't up until now have been at college education, educational attainment, and college attendance. So this research sort of extends that window a little further out with a population that doesn't often get studied. And with that, I will stop the share of my screen, and I'd be happy to answer questions or talk further about any of these details or other details that people are interested in.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. Yeah, if you have questions, you can, of course, you could just unmute yourself and ask them, but you can also put them in the Q&A. And we have one question already in the Q&A, so I'll just repeat that for you. This question is from Abby Sunchin. I hope I'm saying that correctly. She says, given the challenges in collecting data from under-researched, underserved populations, what are your recommendations for effectively communicating, conducting research, working with these groups? Are there any particular ethical considerations we should keep in mind when working with these populations and collecting data from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's one that we should all ask ourselves in general when doing research. And I think smaller populations and marginalized groups have the least agency or voice in a lot of research. So it's even more sensitive. So I think the answer is when working with small populations and again, marginalized group, having a collaborator, a colleague, somebody who's coming from these populations and communities is often the best ways. And if that's not possible, that's definitely not always possible or feasible, then having someone who's experienced and has worked previously, has some track record of doing good work and ethical work in these areas, I think is important. And so, I think making choices about who you work with and who you work on behalf of, organizationally or individually, I think those are the ways in which you can make good choices and good connections. And then, having said that, there are organizations that exist broadly that do research and are intended to be sort of a bridging organization and foster and encourage good methods, good relationships, good data analysis. One is an organization that I and a number of other of our colleagues, Joe and his colleagues as well, have helped found and establish. It's called the Association for Economic Research of Indigenous Peoples. And our whole purpose is just to be sort of a central place for people to meet each other, to talk about research ideas, to come to conferences and seminars, and to get, feedback on things and our connections. And then having said that, there are other organizations. This is an economics research association, but there are others. There are others for sociology, political science, and not just for Indigenous peoples. There are people who do work on, again, immigrants. There are people who do work on African Americans, on Asian Americans, on Latinos. So, I think finding those kind of colleagues and organizations that are already doing this work and have a track record, and either working with them or consulting with them or collaborating with them is really the way to go. Because again, there's lots of lessons to be learned that you don't want to have to learn on your own necessarily. There's lots of pitfalls of misusing data, again, inadvertently, because there's so many complicated things about the way data is collected, or where the way in which people are categorized for historical, legal, political reasons across the board. And understanding that, because that can have an impact on the consistency of the data that you use. So if you're looking at, population sizes or income growth over time or something like that, because of miscategorization or changes in categorization over time, there may look like there are huge jumps or huge falls, but it really has to do with just a basic data series issue. And experienced people will be able to tell you that right off. And so, you can get, 5 steps ahead of understanding a data set if you work, or at least, listen to and engage with people who have experience in that. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, seek out others who have some experience in this, and that, have a track record, I think, is a really good way of doing it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would follow up on that, but there's another question now in the chat, so I'll read that from Surrender Adekunda. And Surrender asked, is the transition away from poverty permanent after the introduction of casinos and changes in the finances of households, or do similar trends of poverty return after the longer periods of time?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's still a question. It's an open question because we're still in this process. We've had about 25, 30 years of tribal casino operations. So up until now, there's still a maintained, I think, plateauing. There was a huge growth era of the 1990s when incomes went up significantly and wages went up. I think it's plateaued, but it's still a really large amount. It's, on the order, last year was $40 billion for the industry in the US, American Indian gaming. And that, to be clear, it's that's not for all tribal nations. Not all of them have casinos. Not all of them do universal basic income cash transfers. And some have absolutely none. And some do other types of economic development that works for them, that they're able to do. And others have little economic development for various reasons, political institutions and land-based jurisdiction and various things. So it's not I don't mean to say it's a solution to all problems. What I do think is interesting is the economic development aspect of it, and it has this impact on, again, the first generation, the parents, but also the second generation. So, if I were to predict, another 20 or 30 years, observing the increase in educational attainment of the children, that can't be taken away, right? That is not, it's human capital, and it's not a, financial capital. So it's not something that people will lose. So I think given that we're seeing this again in the first study that I did, but then even in the broader study, it appears that educational attainment is going up, and we think educational attainment, has long-run payoffs. There's been, decades of research on that, separate from American Indians, that kind of confirms that. So I do think that the impact of this industry may have long-run outcomes, long-term impacts through that route. Number one, the educational attainment of the children, the next generation. And I do think some tribes have diversified. I haven't done a lot of work in that. It's really hard to do because you have to gather a lot of additional data. But some have, anecdotally, we know that there's some change or augmentation to their economic development. They go into tourism, they go into hotel development, they go into other types of manufacturing and service provision, for instance. So there are other things that occur. And so the tribal casino can be sort of a spur that starts, again, an increase in human capital, and then the sort of innovation and entrepreneurship as well can sort of permeate. I don't have a lot of evidence on that, unfortunately, because, again, collection of data on these other industries still kind of difficult to do. But nevertheless, I think there would be some evidence of that, but it's still kind of an open question.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I know you've done some work on tribal investment in institutions, which, some of which is enabled by casino revenue.
Yeah, that's right.
Investment in community colleges, investment in police forces, investment in their judiciary, things like that. And those things as well, I would think would be long lasting, maybe not permanent, but certainly long lasting.
It appears anyway. That's right. And, again, it is in some communities, it's, these tribal casinos are relatively new. They're 10 years old. There are some that started in 2014 and others that started in the early 2000s. So, and then others that started in the 90s. So you have this staggered sort of rollout across different tribal nations when this occurred. So yeah, I think we don't have across the board evidence that everybody matured at the same rate or they diversified at the same rate. They may or may not. Some of it has to do with geographic and regional differences in their economies and their natural resource endowments and their connectivity to other. So yeah, I think there's so many factors there, but I think given the increase in educational attainment, that should be hopefully a long-lived outcome. But yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, those are some striking results I think you had with the effect on education.
Yeah, we were pleasantly surprised that we could get any results there, because again, the sample sizes are so small and you don't know if it's going to translate from the one community to the national level.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just add one follow-up question.
Yeah.
If you can tell me that one tribe that had the casino you were following, did that tribe improve their, did they invest in their own high schools and community colleges on their reservation? And maybe that's part of
Yeah. So that exactly. So the revenues from tribal casinos are mandated by Congress, the U.S. Congress, primarily to invest back into the community. One way you can do it is by sending cash transfers to your tribal citizens. Another way is to invest in institutions, as well as off reservation. You can provide funds to the county sheriff because there might be an increase in, lawlessness was the idea, but also on reservation tribal governing institutions like the local police force, but also, funding housing programs and health programs, education. And so it's a little bit more technical in terms of our paper, but ultimately they did invest in a number of things, use the revenues to invest in a number of things on the reservation. For our purposes, a lot of those programs started towards the end of when the children that we're looking at were in adolescence. So they probably wouldn't have been affected by that. But nevertheless, the next generation of children absolutely would be much more directly affected by the improvement in services and resources on reservation lands.
Yeah. We have one more question, another question here. This is actually from Jen. We've had some different talks and discussions around rural poverty many speakers and researchers lump Native communities in with other rural areas.
Hmm.
Do you feel like that is a reasonable approach, or do you think something is lost when we lump those categories?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's great. It's just, I think it depends on what the outcome that one is looking at and whether it should be separated. If you're thinking about land ownership and investment in land, well, then tribal nations exist differently. There are different political, legal institutions, and so they're governed separately and differently than other counties. The counties are governed by the counties, and tribal nations are governed by the tribal elected officials, and ownership is different there. If you're looking at investment or productivity of the land, they also might differ for different reasons: access to capital, access to infrastructure. So yeah, it can differ, I think. On the other hand, too, there are some tribes that are not rural at all. They're very urban. Right outside of Phoenix, there are a very big U.S. city right outside of San Diego and L.A. Not too far away, there are reservations that are abutting either suburbs or in some cases actual cities. So not a lot of them, but there are significant numbers. It's not just one or two. So yeah, it's like for ease, often as you're saying, we're often sort of lumped into rural categories or population, but that's not always the case. So I think it depends on the question. I think it depends on the way in that one is interested in looking at outcomes and data, whether or not that is a good categorization or not. So I think it's all dependent on the question.
Yeah, for sure. I know you
Hmm.
collaborate with folks at the census, and you talked about a couple of census products, the CPS and the ACS, while you were presenting things. And I think whenever I look at that kind of data from the census, not so much the CPS, because I think that's kind of designed that way, but the ACS and the decennial censuses, they really depend on people responding to their surveys.
Yeah.
And when the census publishes data on response rates in different geographies, and they tend to be low in Indian country, I think, as you know. I'm wondering if you know about ways that the census might be working on improving response rates in Indian country for those those census products that we all kind of rely on.
I mean, I think the standard is that there's multiple outreach methods that are done: phone calls, emails, letters, and then in extreme cases, people, enumerators might actually come to people's homes and knock on doors. And I think there are minimum thresholds below which sort of trigger the extra work that's needed to get responses from a particular geography, for instance. So I think those are already in place. And then the census has, again, to my understanding, it's a lot of experience in this. And so they tend to weight those non-response areas with, so with those who respond with extra weight. And so you get what's expected to be an equivalent, appropriately equivalent. But yeah, I think the only way in doing it is encouraging and getting sort of the participation of people, and the other way respondents are increased and methods are through through organizational word of mouth. So in the run up to the censuses, for instance, of course, there's lots of engagement done with tribal nations to encourage their own citizens to participate and answer the census. The ACS is a little bit harder because it happens every single year, and it's a 2% sample, so it's hard to encourage people to do it because you don't know who's going to do it or who's going to get the call for it. But yeah, with the census, for sure, there's always that. The other way is what I was sort of alluding to in some of my own work is the use of administrative data, which is collected automatically in a sense, right? People have to turn in their taxes. Employers have to turn in W-2 forms. So there might be ways of filling in gaps for the population using some administrative data, right? And there's also, there's unemployment data that the states collect, on a quarterly basis. That might, be an improvement on having to survey people because you've got the, state by state, and not all states participate in the sharing of that information. But it's increasingly, there are these options. And so I think, one of the big things that exists for anybody collecting data is the sort of the survey fatigue that people have, and the non-response in general, let alone the ACS and the census, but just for things like the SIP or the CPS. And so if there are ways, I think, if there are ways of using existing data that kind of mirror some of those outcomes, that might be the future, because people are automatically reporting it, and it's less invasive or less burdensome. That might be a way of getting around some of this in the future. It won't get everything, because there are many, many, many more interesting questions that aren't part of administrative data, but maybe at least for those aspects, those questions wouldn't have to be asked all the time. You could ask the more interesting ones, like, what's your outlook on X, Y, and Z, or how do you forecast your life going? And the interesting things that can't be got, sort of derived from administrative data and administrative data sources. But, were you employed last month? Maybe we already have that information and can be accessed and used and reduced, the length of the survey questionnaire that you have to answer, for instance. So. Yeah, I think there are some options, but creativity and also the ability to access these data sets is something that matters as well, and figuring out ways to sort of straddle the privacy concerns, which are very real, but also the public use of some data sets, and what level of aggregation is appropriate for concealing and protecting people's confidential information, but still usable enough that it can be informative.
Yeah, and I think there's the historic trust issue between them.
Yeah, it matters, of course, yeah.
All right, well, thanks, Randy. I think that's our time.
Okay.
I think it was such a pleasure to see you again.
I really appreciate it being here, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Love to get you back out to Virginia to talk to us sometime.